All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, actually. And great to see you all here. Thank you so much to the CoMotion team for putting on a really fantastic program. We are so excited to be one of the kickoff events here. My name is Sam Adams. I'm the co-founder and CEO of .LA, which is a recently launched tech and media focused publication for the LA tech and startup ecosystem. So we are really fascinated with all of the amazing transitions that are happening in transportation and mobility. And so we're so honored to be able to participate in this great event and to welcome all of you to LA. So we are really excited to be having a conversation today about financing future mobility and transportation. So by 2050, global urban mobility investment is expected to total $40 trillion, with trillions more needed to complete the transition to a clean, shared, and autonomous future. And so today we've gathered a really illustrious group of representatives from industry, from government, from the incubator and accelerator world, to explore some of the trends and technologies that are going to be driving the VC and investment landscape for mobility in the years and decades to come. We're going to be looking at where public investment and policy can work together and be a force multiplier. Similarly, looking at some of the financial instruments that have come into vogue in the recent years, and looking at the future of investment in the space. And so with that, I'm really excited to introduce our panel. Jeanette, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure. I can't see anyone's eyes, so I'm going to stare off to the ethos with all the people that are hyper passionate about everything transportation and mobility. So there we go. Jeanette Jackson, I'm the CEO of Foresight. We are Canada's largest clean tech accelerator. Before that, though, I was a serial entrepreneur. So I've been in the shoes of looking for the right product market fit, trying to find the money to fund and scale my venture, and then, of course, looking at exit strategies. And I do a bit of investing as well. Why is transportation important to us at Foresight? We do a lot of ecosystem building as part of our accelerator work. And the more we engage with governments, with industry, the reality is that our infrastructure needs a complete overhaul. And as you mentioned, $40 trillion is a lot. I happen to be at COP, where $130 trillion in capital was sort of announced with Mark Carney, who is also a Canadian. And so at the end of the day, not only is there a critical need for us to move quickly in this transition, but the capital's there and we need to figure out how to collaborate to make that happen. So look forward to the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Lori Pepper. I am the Deputy Secretary for Innovative Mobility Solutions at the California State Transportation Agency. The agency is the cabinet level entity, and we oversee the 8 transportation related departments. So many that you guys have probably worked with, including Caltrans, DMV, Highway Patrol, High Speed Rail, and then 4 other smaller ones. My job is really to look at how can we apply mobility technology and best practices in order to ease the mobility of people and goods throughout the state. And so with that mission, I really rely on conversations with the private sector, because we need to know exactly what's going on, how it'll work, how can we help support, gain those benefits that we all know are promised through this technology. And I look forward to the discussion.
Hello, everybody. My name is Patrick Hessel, and I'm the CEO and majority shareholder of Aeromobile. At Aeromobile, we're developing a flying car that is a vehicle that can drive on the road and seamlessly transform into a plane. And thereby, we have basically a 2-step strategy. The first vehicle is a ultra niche, ultra high-end vehicle. Think of it as a flying Bugatti. Really to build an exclusive and very interesting and well-known brand. But the ultimate step, the second step, is really offering a ride-hailing service that is, think of it as a flying Uber, where you order the vehicle to your house, and that is that the vehicle takes you to a nearby grass strip runway, and you take off from there and get delivered to your final destination. So within a range of 100 to 500 miles. So it's actually a very unique solution as such, and the only true door-to-door solution that is tailored for the convenience of the clients. And prior to Aeromobile, where I'm the CEO for 2 years, I built an industrial company doing carbon fibers components, supplying the automotive and aerospace industry, and sold that company. So basically became an investor, looked into the wider segment, and decided to invest into Aeromobile. Looking forward to the discussion.
Hello, I'm Gabriel, and I'm with Elemental Accelerator. We're an accelerator based in Honolulu and Palo Alto, and we focus on supporting entrepreneurs working across 5 different sections of climate tech. So there's mobility, energy, water, food and agriculture, and circular economy. And in my case, I get to run the portfolio that focuses on both mobility and energy. So I get to work with companies across those 2, including some eVTOL type technologies, some hydrogen. We've been working with Remix, which got acquired by Via, Proterra, Exos Trucks, which was, I think, here last or 2 years ago. But a variety of different entities really working to kind of root out the systems level things we can do to impact on climate using our accelerator as sort of the tool for that. Prior to Elemental, I've worked in mobility and in energy quite a bit. Most notably, perhaps, I was on the founding team at Lime, and so I got to work with cities across North America as well as around the world on Lime's growth from a little bike sharing company when I joined to what it is now. So yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And Patrick, I was wondering, what to put in my wish list to Santa this year, but I think flying Bugatti just went to the top of that list. So, all right. Well, I wanted to kick this conversation off with just a slight discussion of the various massive infrastructure investments that are happening at the public sector level right now. I mean, the recent passage of the Build Back Better bill is, going to be diverting a huge amount of capital into infrastructure investment. I would say, long overdue and well needed. And so, if one of the points of this conversation is to, explore the relationship between the private sector and the public sector to, address some of these challenges and capture some of these opportunities. What do you think about this bill and similar ones that have been passing in other countries, as well as what the private sector's role is in complementing those sorts of investments?
So I'm the Canadian on the panel, but I will say that 80% of our exports or ventures need to export. So in order to grow, the US is a huge market opportunity. I'll let others comment specifically on the bill, but in Canada, we have very similar functions taking place. So there's $3.3 billion, which sounds little, but for a smaller country is quite a lot for a net zero accelerator. The new infrastructure bank has a new head, a new strategy, and it's all going to be focused on transitioning mobility. Of course, there's going to be considerations around water and built environment as well. But at the end of the day, one of the things that separates Canada a little bit from the rest of the world is when you're an early stage venture, you have so much access to government funding to really get you through that early R&D cycle. And you're allowed to leverage that funding with either industry partners or other investors that are going to come in early on. Where it gets interesting for us is that when the ventures are looking to scale, they often look to the States because that's where the big money is. And when you're building a technology, as all of you well know, and most of you on the panel here, the capital requirements when you're building this type of, it's not digital, right? It's not just something you can sit in a computer and put together. We've got to prototype and do pilots and all these different things. So in Canada, we have a lot of different mechanisms, but when it comes to really scaling, we're now seeing a complementary level of commitment that we need to put the capital on the table to be able to really allow this massive transition across many communities across a broad area. So on the US side, I'll definitely pass it over to you.
Well, I think you bring up a great point. One of the things that we're really excited about, and I will say our federal people are still going through the bill to tell us exactly what's in it. But one of the things that I'm really excited about is there is more money in order to do some of these pilots and demonstrations, in order to, there's more flexibility in how we can use the money and really test this stuff and then also move it towards implementation. I think that's the key, because we get stuck a lot of times in the demonstration and pilot kind of venue, and getting it to actual implementation is very difficult. And I'm sure many of you know the procurement system is not friendly. It makes a lot of things very burdensome and difficult. And so we are looking for different ways to approach that. But this bill, I think, gives us a lot of opportunity to really experiment with what's out there, hopefully to bring on some pilots and demonstrations with companies that don't have the funding or the market capital in order to do no cost demonstrations for the state. And so that's something that I'm personally really looking forward to. And I think, that's also where we're going to be looking for some partners, probably a little bit more proactively than we have in the past.
I'll touch on it briefly. I think that one of the interesting things about the bill is the signals it sends from a federal level of what we're prioritizing. And as you said, Jeanette, earlier, that it's an ecosystem, right? It's not like the federal government has decided and now everything is different or is fixed or is whatever. There are all these pieces that have to come into play. So we really focus on early stage, and in particular, setting up the pilots that often are needed, because I've got a technology, but I don't actually know how it'll work in the real world, or I want to deploy it and see, working with city partners, community partners, frontline communities who are being impacted by the technologies or by climate change. We want to work with these different groups and figure it out. And so I think there's a need across the whole ecosystem, everywhere from pilots in the beginning phases of a very small company all the way up through massive amounts of money. And if you look at the DOE's loan program office, Scheer runs it right now. I think there's something like $40 billion of loans available right now for scaling technology, which is awesome. And it could double in the next bill if it passes. And so you have a lot of signal from the federal government about what we're trying to prioritize. And that kind of capital is needed. But then to your point, Jeanette, again, in the sort of the COP side of things, Mark Carney and some of the financial instruments that are being brought to bear, I think in some ways is also just as big, if not bigger of a deal, because you're starting to leverage the financial industry to push some of this stuff. So I think net it's the ecosystem, and we're starting to see a lot of the pieces fall into place to really move the needle on a whole lot of things.
I have a couple. Do you have a comment as well? A couple of things I was thinking about, you asked about what the role of the private sector is. I think we can all agree that Tesla's done quite an interesting job, because they're now investing in actually putting up the infrastructure so that the communities in which their buyers live are not burdened with the cost of putting in those high impact or high capacity chargers. Another thing that I was thinking about in terms of these sort of big buckets of funding is, at what point do we look at what's incremental and what we can do now? And at what point do we look forward and think about how much of that investment can go into that big blue sky stuff, like your types of investments, right? Or like your type of technology. So I'd love to see a little bit more road mapping and the opportunity to incorporate not only those sort of short-term gaps that we know exist to move the needle, incrementally X%. How do we go really big and try to incorporate some of these other ideas? And then a final thing that we've really started to look at Foresight is we do a lot of innovation challenges. And so when we think of mobility and transportation, there's the community level, but there's also the industry level. They're moving goods and services and products, whether it's mining, whether it's the ports. And so for us, integrating, transportation holistically and mobility into those conversations, we think it's a great way to pilot technologies that are a little bit more forward looking, such as hydrogen on long range vehicles, such as hydrogen into, water vessels, etc. So a lot of opportunity here. How do we focus? Because it's still not enough money, right?
No, absolutely. And I think that is a big part of like the challenge here, right? I mean, there's so much to be done, and the way that the private sector and public sector needs to kind of interact in order to test things out and, eventually bring them operating at scale. I think to that end, I was curious about, like, I think Laura, you mentioned this a little bit as well. The way that procurement processes are changing, and the way that we can be, whether it's cutting through red tape or just being intelligent about how how many of the dozens of agencies, I mean, in the state of California alone, I think are, making these kind of decisions. What are some of these changes that will hopefully lead to kind of a more sophisticated and long-term perspective on these sorts of decisions?
Sure. So there's two that I can think of specifically. The first one of Governor Newsom's first executive orders allowed for an RFI squared for the state government, which was brand new for us. We in transportation don't have the authority because it was focused on wildfires. So it was focused on our Department of General Services and our Department of Technology. But in transportation, the DMV has actually taken advantage of that, and they have put out problem statements, and we have an annual vendor day where we go through, and most of their stuff is really looking at how to make the customer facing process a lot easier. We're looking at it now in kind of a broader sense in our technology through Caltrans about what would we do if we wanted to prioritize problem statements and to go through that process as opposed to your traditional RFP. The other thing we're doing is through a program called Cal ITP, which is the Integrated Travel Project. That one's looking at how do we make travel seamless, especially when it comes to planning and payments. And what we've done there is we've really, quite honestly, looked at the private sector and tried to copy it. We've done a bunch of market soundings as opposed to RFIs. And those have been, you can set those up a lot quicker. You can have a lot more flexibility in the conversations that you have. And those have been really enlightening to us about what is going on, what ideas can we then help implement with our technology or with our systems. And then we've taken those lessons and we've actually gone and decided to do a statewide MSA and then list vendors that go through the verification and validation process. And that way, all public agencies, and right now we're focused on transit, so all transit agencies, not just in California, but across the country, can actually purchase off of the state MSA. And so we've taken a lot of the burden, especially for transit agencies that are really small, don't have the resources, can't hire a procurement attorney. We're trying to take that off of their plate and therefore making it easier for them, but then also making it easier for the private sector to reach all of those different entities. In California alone, we have more than 400 transit agencies, but there's such a gulf between markets like Los Angeles or San Francisco, and then, some of the smaller rural agencies that we have. So we're trying to say, okay, what is the state role? As all of these agencies are independent, how can we actually be that bridge between the public and private sector?
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And Patrick, I'm interested to hear, obviously you have a different perspective, the European and industry side perspective, but what has your experience been like with these kind of public-private partnership type dynamics?
So we have received some government funding in Slovakia because the engineering team is based in Slovakia. The business team is pretty much global, mostly US based. And early on, we received government funding for R&D initiatives in the country. Meanwhile, as we're looking to roll out and to start manufacturing the vehicles the next, starting 2 years from now, and we're looking to do that in the US. So we are in conversations with individual states about manufacturing, and we see that certain states are very eager to support, especially the future aerial mobility segment, and so really that's where we are in terms of our conversations. And this is mostly about pretty much supporting the setup of factories and manufacturing jobs and this type of things.
No, and Gabriel, any perspective from I know that you're that you have a long and storied relationship with government relations. Do you have any thoughts on what we can be doing better from this type of perspective?
This is kind of building on a conversation we were having backstage about sort of the relationship often between, in particular, micromobility startups and cities, but more bigger picture tech or industry and government. And I think we could go for hours if you guys all want to sit around and listen to reflections on that. But I'll kind of go short on a reflection, I guess, on the speed that we need to go, which is to say climate change isn't waiting for us to sort of think about things and put together a multi-year RFP. And I love what you're talking about, Lori, on the sort of MSA that can enable, like you think of the very small cities that don't have the resources and they could suddenly do this. I think working with Lime as a government relations person, I was going to cities all over the place and trying to convince them to let us deploy on their streets, at first bicycles and eventually scooters. And it was really interesting to see the different ways that they treated us. Some of them sort of like, okay, this is interesting. We're open to pilots. We're open to building a business in our city. In many cases, the paradigm was interesting to observe. If you think of cities in sort of political terms, like the more reddish cities, the more bluish cities, and the different characteristics, some of them would have sort of a laundry list of the things that they wanted us to fix. We have this transit desert over here, and it's underserved in all these different ways. Can you fix that? And if you can, then you can deploy, where you'll actually make money as well. And if you can't, then maybe not. Other cities, like, you're going to create jobs and you're going to help people move around. That's great. Other cities saw the potential for data capture, for example, that we could share with those cities. And at first we were as novice as they were in terms of, like, we got data coming off bikes. Every 5 minutes you get a ping from a GPS tracker and it's really cool. And some cities right away were like, oh, that's great. That's data we never had before. And other cities like, what, 5-minute data off bikes? What are we going to do with that? And I had one public works director specifically tell me, that's really interesting. You can do that, but what on earth? I'm thinking about pipes. I'm thinking about roads. I don't know what to do with what you're talking about. And so the capacity gaps between some of the cities that we worked with were really interesting. And of course, then you had a lot of what I would suggest as PTSD from previous launches by previous mobility tech companies. And to put one of them to name simply because it was used as a verb, one of the city officials I was working with said to me, look, I don't want to get Uberized again. And it was a really interesting point of reflection. And I counterpointed with, that's why I'm here talking to you before we launch, is because we're not trying to do that. But it's interesting that the shock from that system was real, and they felt it years later, right? This is 8 years after, in this case, Uber had launched in that particular city. And I think there is a reconciliation that has to come around. We need to move fast. We can't wait to figure out all these things. On the other hand, for example, with deploying scooters in the beginning, are they safe for public streets is a very legitimate question to ask. Are these a thing that we can put in the public right of way and keep people safe in relative terms? And I say relative terms because 40,000 something people die on US highways every year. So relative terms is a real thing. But it is fair to ask those questions. If you're going to have a flying Bugatti type vehicle, is it safe for people to get in and to move around our cities? We have the infrastructure to support it, is a very legitimate question, and time needs to be taken to consider that. On the flip side, we got to change how we're doing things. And infrastructure is not there in any way. When we rolled our first bikes out, immediately you saw the externalities, which are to say the problems of bikes tipped over, lying on the sidewalk, bikes left in funny places intentionally or otherwise. I remember the first call I got in Seattle, which was our first major market, in which I was told, hey, there's a bike hanging from a telephone wire. You have to get it down now. And it was like, how do we do that? That's not something we've had to think about before. And at the time we had a double-decker viaduct in Seattle, and someone had bothered to go up on a car-only viaduct and throw a bike off of said viaduct onto said telephone wire. And now we have to figure out how to get it down. And conveniently, we got it down before it was even a problem. But it was that kind of thing that happened. And so those are the externalities you don't necessarily see coming. Like, who knew that that's a thing that people would decide needed to be done? But the city also didn't have proper infrastructure to park them. And so that went along with the bikes falling over on sidewalks kind of problem. And that's an evolution piece that has to happen, and very much an ecosystem play where we have to work together to take this new opportunity to solve a problem and solve the problems that it's going to bring with it.
No, absolutely. And that's a great segue into, something that we were talking about a little bit backstage, but I think is a really important piece of this kind of dynamic that we're exploring in this conversation, which is the push-pull between startup mentality and government regulation mentality, which is there to keep us safe, and that's an insanely important piece of this. And so you use the phrase Uberized there, which is reflective of this mentality that I would say is especially prevalent in this space. Of the the ask for forgiveness, not for permission. If you just launch in a market and then you can negotiate with the government from there. I would say that is that seems to be fairly unsustainable in the longer term. And so, yeah, I think that I would be interested to hear other perspectives on that dynamic and that push pull, and where it should go.
Well, it's one of my personal mantras. So I'm a huge fan of asking for forgiveness. Not something I would teach my 14-year-old daughter, but it's certainly something that I reflect on. Now, but there is a balance, right? Because when there are regulations and permitting, at the end of the day, some of these pieces are taking so long that the ventures just don't have the runway. And so what I would prefer to see as an accelerator, I'd love your opinion. I went to Elemental in my first 90 days in this role, and they're doing amazing work. So I'm really excited that we get to collaborate today. But what we'd like to see is ventures collaborating a little bit more. And instead of having to go one-on-one with every entity, why don't ventures that have a suite of services come together and say, look, as a community, we would like to provide you with bikes and infrastructure and X, Y, Z, mopeds, whatever it is, right? So that you can sort of tackle a suite of regulation challenges all at once. And so those are things that we're trying to curate through sort of mini clusters throughout the province of British Columbia, in the transportation space, who's interested in tackling what. Some of it even includes manufacturing of batteries and things like that. How can we get them to come together and put together a holistic story on a transportation hub so that it's, like you said, really a lot easier for the government officials to navigate and for the ventures to have more certainty on whether or not they should actually continue investing in that market. Lots of other ideas there, but
So I think you bring up a great point. I love that idea of really clustering the services and coming to us with a full product and process, because we know that there are many things that we don't know, and how it all fits together is absolutely one of those things. From the government side, I don't think anybody would be surprised that I will say we would prefer the ask for permission process. But I think, the ask for permission process, I think can be tweaked. And, like Gabriel has been saying, right, he's talking about climate change and sustainability. And I think that's what we're all talking about here. What I'm finding is that the companies that come to us are saying, I have an idea, I have a product, I have a process to solve a problem. And because of that, and because we are all trying to solve these problems, I think approaching in a way that is more solution oriented, as opposed to, I want to get my technology on the road or in the air or, in the water, wherever it is something that personally I would recommend, something that I very much appreciate. I think also along those same lines, when coming to a public agency, and this is based off a conversation that I had probably 2 months ago, and saying, I'll just say, I would not say things like public transit is dead, so you should give us all the money, right? Looking at, instead of trying to take over the entire transportation system, one thing that we think about a lot is the concept of equity. And is equity the concept that everybody gets access to everything and every mode and every technology, or is equity really about mobility and the ability to just move around easily? So how does your technology, how does your process fill in those gaps and add value to the concept of mobility equity versus trying to kind of take over and just get as much out there? That is something that I personally appreciate more than just, I have this product and we should just get it out there and this is how it should be.
Actually, just to kind of build on that, I think there are a couple terms that I would think about that I think both sides could learn a lot from each other, both sides being government and sort of industry or tech or whatever we're talking about. On the government side, I think one of the challenges and gaps, Jeanette, you kind of touched on this, is speed. Being in a startup means you're inherently having to go as fast as you possibly can. You're working all hours. You know that there is a runway at the end of which you fall off a cliff of finance, right? Like you run out of money and that's the end, game over. And with Lime, we felt this very, very clearly, right? We're deploying assets on city streets. They're going to get depreciated really fast, destroyed, or just worn out or whatever. there's a very real hard cost to every single bike or scooter or whatever that gets put down. And we know that at some point the money runs out and game is over. If we have not proven that this model works, the investment community won't fund us any further. We don't have any more way to continue. And I think, Jeanette, you said this about government. Sometimes government looks, it's like, yeah, we'll take a process and we'll think about this and whatever. And I think from the government side, a missing piece sometimes is an understanding of the speed with which these things rise and fall, or can rise and fall, if government support or acquiescence isn't forthcoming. Which leads to a second point around sandboxing, which I think is really interesting. You know, when we first launched with Lime, in a lot of places, it was considered a pilot. We're going to launch a pilot to see how this goes, with the implicit and obvious possibility that we decide the pilot doesn't work and you guys are out of here. Great, we'll take a pilot any day of the week because it means we get to start playing on your streets, we get to start showing value, we get to start developing customer base, et cetera. Like that makes a lot of sense. Gives the city the opportunity to learn, are you actually solving a problem that our city has, or are you simply here because BC said that you're a good idea and they gave you money and now you get to go play? And I would say that the best of that is the sandbox proves, yeah, actually this thing solves a real problem. And maybe it creates new ones that now we get to go solve together, because who knew that people were going to throw bikes on telephone wires or whatever? We've got to solve these problems. And I think the third thing I want to touch on briefly just is humility, which I think it's really easy, especially when you've got a technology, it feels sexy. Some VC has given you some money and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm on top of the world. I've created this cool new thing. It's very easy to go into a city and be like, we've got this thing, we're solving all the problems. And you said it about like shutting down transit or whatever, like we can take over that. And it is easy, like I've got a hammer and everything is a nail, but that's not actually true. And there are systems in place for a reason. And I think sometimes, particularly when we were launching, it was easy to see us as an extension of that thing that had come before Uber or Lyft or whatever. And you're going to kind of roll in here and do the same thing. And a lot of our job was to show the humility of like, no, we're not actually. And we actually can't solve all your problems. In fact, in a best case implementation, our bikes and scooters complement the trains and buses that run through your city streets right now. If we do this right, you win, we build a business together, and this thing really changes things for the better. But having the humility to know that you can't solve all the problems, having the humility to say, actually, okay, I get that there's a reason that you're asking us to wait. You're asking us not to roll quite yet. And the last piece is simply the policy piece often is gray. So for example, when we first looked at markets with Lime Bike as a bike company, we were looking around thinking like, what cities have rules that tell us where we can or can't go? And in many cases, there weren't rules. And particularly when we came with scooters, there was no clear rule in a lot of cities that says you can do this, but there's also no clear rule that says you can't do this, which is ambiguity, which can be very useful for a lot of reasons. The city can use that ambiguity to say, we're going to test this because there's no thing that says we can't. And we don't have to involve, decision makers at a higher level to get a policy that says we can. From a company perspective, ambiguity can mean, should we just go? Like there's nobody telling us not to. So there's a lot of sort of ambiguity that can tie to good and bad things, which come back to humility and speed. And I think those things tied together kind of creates your operating environment.
And I just want to add one thing, because it reminded me of a communications class in college where the first rule of communications is to know your audience. So, when you go to a government regulator, understand where they're coming from and what they're actually looking at.
I thought with the sandbox comment, you were going to migrate to, instead of pilots, innovation sandboxes.
Totally.
Okay. If I don't know if everyone's familiar, you might better define it than I do, but we're moving that needle on the narrative as well, because an innovation sandbox is constant. It's not turning on and off. It's an open door policy to continue to evolve and innovate and give a platform where the regulation is a little bit more flexible, where there's perhaps some different types of partnerships, business models, and a whole bunch of things that you can trial. And it's going to be continuous and ongoing because there's an end goal that's not just at the end of this pilot. It's a long-term transition, hopefully shorter than long, given the 2030 climate targets. But so I'm a huge fan of innovation sandboxes, and it's something that that we're really trying to push the narrative on and across Canada with the work we do.
I would say also from our side, we're still some time away from the launch of the actual aerial ride service. Most important for us is of course to certify the hardware, so the vehicle, both to the automotive legislation as well as the airspace legislation as the basis. And so we're obviously working on that. And then the actual rollout is still some time away. So it's going to be an interesting time for sure.
And just to build on that, because you bring up a really good point, we have actually started doing work on how do we manage the skyways, right? What does it mean when we are moving people and goods by air when it comes to safety and equity? What are the roles of the federal, state, and local governments? And I think we need to do more, because we just kicked off a study on November 1st that has to do with this. And we need to do more to probably be a little bit more public about that so that companies like yours can come in and have that conversation at the very beginning, as opposed to when we're already kind of think we have the answers or we're too far down the road to make any changes. And so I think that's why just an open line, an ongoing line of communication between the public and private sectors is so critical, because you never know where people are in process. And if you can get in early, it's always better.
No, that was great. Thank you. So I think that was a really great transition to the next thing that I thought would be good to cover, which is the private investment schemes that are financing, especially in the early stage and increasingly in later in growth stages, how that is changing and kind of where the opportunities are. Because I think that this space in particular is really fascinating because it is very capital intensive and it involves pretty long time frames, especially in the case, Patrick, of flying cars and really new categories of hard tech. And so when you're talking about companies having to operate at startup speed, and we got to get scooters on the ground, because we have a runway, and we have to scale kind of under the same timelines as software companies and things that more naturally kind of can scale. Where do we think that is going? And Patrick, I wanted to start with you on this one, because as the entrepreneur in the weeds on this right now, what are you seeing in the market, and like what opportunities do you think that there might be for any current or future entrepreneurs in the audience right now?
So first of all, I would say, of course, the awareness of a huge future total addressable market is probably the most important base element for investors to come into that market. So we now see with more and more studies on the future of aerial mobility that is going to be a massive market, and that obviously drew into the segment, I think more than 10 billion investment, at least into the VTOL space, the eVTOL space, which is just mostly in the last 12 months, which is a huge shift from before. So having followed this segment for years, it was very, I would say, rather slow for many years, and then it was almost like a kind of snowball effect in the last 12, 18 months. And from a personal perspective, as a private investor looking into investing into this space or into anything really, I was always looking at can you find a niche where basically you would be one of the first, potentially the first, where you don't have much competition, and because obviously competition drives down the margins ultimately, and where you can be early on and then kind of develop so quickly that you take that lead and stay in that lead position. And then obviously competition always comes in as you demonstrate that it's a viable and big market. But that's ultimately how I personally look at some investments, and this one specifically, where I saw there's a huge hype almost, or development and in the eVTOL space and VTOL space, but at the same time there's about 300 companies or hundreds of companies operating in that space, a huge amount of competition, similar to the EV space now. And so for sure some companies will be successful, but it also by definition means that probably more than 90% won't be, because there's just not so much space for hundreds of companies in one very new segment. That's why also I personally chose a segment that I believe is clearly differentiated with a kind of door-to-door aerial mobility, to where we been in this industry for a long time and kind of a leader in this specific space, which still has a potential of tens of billions of annual revenue. So anyway, that's just another perspective. And when you ask about where the funding can come from, I mean, we're privately funded, but we've had, many conversations with all sorts of investors, banks, competitors, etc. So it's been a lot of learning. Of course, you've seen more recently SPACs being the big thing. The SPAC was largely about credibility of partnerships. I think more so than anything else, as we've seen. So having two main large contracts can actually put you on a SPAC path. And if not on a SPAC path, then obviously on a path of a very large private fundraise. So I think this is typically it can be a manufacturing contract with one of the leading, let's say, manufacturers of vehicles or within your space, and also a kind of go-to-market partnership that demonstrates that there is a real demand from the market, and then that a leading player is partnering with you, which demonstrates really they believe in you being able to deliver on that towards the market. And we are also very close to having two such major partnerships, because that was really the main objective now to raise much larger raise, let's say in a triple digit. You probably want 2 or 3 partnerships with some of the leading players. And what else I found is that family offices and even institutional investors are more prone to enter this segment compared to maybe even 2 years ago, simply because it was considered very risky. But now, especially with Joby and especially Rivian, they're really showing that pre-revenue companies can have a huge valuation, although they haven't really proven the actual model. But at least there's so much expectation, and I guess also Tesla probably the ultimate reason for all that. But so I really see a lot of family offices, private equity firms that would normally not touch pre-revenue companies going into this space, which is really interesting.
That's great. And Gabriel, I mean, you're and Jeanette, you're operating more on the early stage accelerator investor side. Do you think that there are any particular subcategories or like metrics that are really in vogue right now, or increasing in their importance from the investor side?
When you say subcategories, do you mean of technology, or?
Yeah, within mobility, like there's no shortage of sometimes herd mentality among VCs and investors. So I was just, what's the lay of the land right now?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that we look at in all of our portfolio companies is how they engage with the communities they're actually in. So we look at a lot frontline communities where these businesses are operating. How are they going to impact those? And I would say from a funding perspective, you touched on some of this, Patrick, how can you pull in other funders that add to the value you're bringing to that company? So yes, we could write you a check for this much, but it'd be even better if you could get a government grant from a partner agency who says, we see value in this too. And now you're working together and you've all got sort of a stake in this and you're trying to see something happen, which isn't quite addressing your question, but I think it's worth calling out of like, how do you get more engaged entities with that startup? Because it starts to validate the concept more quickly and more with more value in the community it's going to serve, and agencies or others that might have interest. From a tech perspective and what's I don't know what the VC community is focused on from a mobility perspective, I've been surprised how money is still flowing towards the scooter sort of companies writ large, particularly in Europe, which is where most of the action I think is happening right now on actual like growth for those companies. We saw earlier this week, Scheer, which is one of the big European operators, bought a bike share company that gives them cargo and other bikes, like really interesting diversification there. I'm personally excited to see the cargo bike space expand. And I think that's delivery by cargo bike, that's family cargo biking, that's all sorts of different things. But bikes can do a whole lot of cool things that are more than just a single person sitting on a seat. So I'm really excited to see how that goes. And then I think in particular in this country, the relative lack of policy leadership when it comes to supporting bike infrastructure or scooter or cargo bike or whatever means we need some technology solutions to help solve some of those problems. So in Paris, for example, we've seen a lot of movement towards taking away car parking spaces and reallocating those to micromobility devices. We've seen that in London and so forth. We haven't really seen that here. And if we're not going to see that, then we're going to need something else to solve some of the parking and where do I ride questions that come with bikes and scooters and cargo bikes and all the things that I'm talking about here. So I think that curb space management is a part of that. Uni, it's a company out of Brooklyn, has a really interesting parking cargo container. Swift Mile and Commute and various others like them have parking and charging stations. Where those go, partnerships that are needed to deploy them is a really interesting question. But again, we haven't, from a policy perspective in this country, shown a lot of appetite to change our cities for micromobility, which means the private sector, I think, is going to have to step in and fill some of those gaps. So I'm intrigued to see that. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it with that. I think those are things I'm watching.
Yeah, I was going to chuckle because in Vancouver, they've transitioned half the roadway to bike lanes, but they don't allow, they haven't passed policy to actually allow alternative bikes to be on those ways. The rest of Canada is a little cold, so people usually stick to their traditional vehicles. Couple of quick comments I was going to make. Private-public partnerships were a big thing, I'd say, in sort of the 2000s, early 2000s. They kind of started to get a bad rap in Canada. We're starting to see that open up again, which is starting to see more pools of capital to, again, help some of that transition. On the venture side, I've been through that journey, so I definitely get that. One of the things that we're sort of working with our ventures on is how do you make it easier for your buyer to buy as well from a capital perspective, from a finance perspective. And we're seeing a lot more leasing companies come into play or transition some of their investments into new technologies, into clean tech and climate. We're starting to see more blended finance models from banks and other institutions, so it can de-risk early stage investments from some of the more traditionally later stage investment groups. I was in Holland, but we do a lot of work in ag tech as well. I had a really interesting story. I mean, at the end of the day, we all need food to survive, and I think we all need to move to survive, unless we're going to live in Facebook's new world. But what they're seeing is, what is it called? I don't. I'm not the VR guru, that's for sure. I like real tangible things. But what they're seeing in Holland is super interesting because they have to update all their greenhouse technology. Pension funds and private equity firms are getting really invested. So I think once we see some crossing the chasm where some of these transportation and mobility technologies are really taking off, we might really start to see this flush of cash from these investment buckets that traditionally haven't. And then one thing I was thinking about, because you're focusing on autonomous, I mean, what we're really moving towards is mobility as a service. And so I'm going to be keen to follow along and see how that's going to be funded if we're not all buying our own personal vehicles because we don't need to, because what is that going to look like and how is that going to be funded? It's going to be in my opinion, a much more integrated funding model to see that really come to fruition in the coming 10, 20 years, maybe less, given how fast things are moving. So.
Well, that's excellent. Well, thank you. No, that's great. I hope you were taking notes because that was all gold. So thank you to the two of you for that. And actually, Gabriel, one thing that you mentioned there about kind of the changing landscape of the cities themselves and the role that both the the private and public sector are playing in that. I thought that actually might be a good kind of note to start to wrap things up on, where so we're obviously in LA, or those of you who are tuning in, you are tuning into LA. .LA is a Los Angeles focused news, media and events company. And I think that LA really is kind of the world's laboratory for a lot of these trends and technologies that we're talking about here. It's such a unique city, and the challenges that it faces are very largely driven by mobility and car culture and environmentalism and pollution. And so it really is this industry is very personal to this city. And as LA, like many other cities globally, is rapidly changing compared to when I was growing up here. I mean, there actually is some kind of transit infrastructure now, and the rise of the micro mobility solutions, from the scooters to the e-bikes and beyond, as well as shared ride sharing services over the past decade have really changed the landscape of this city. And I think we'll very much continue to do so over the next 6 or 7 years as we build up for the Olympics. And so I know that Lori, you're the main one who actually has LA in their specific purview in some ways. So this isn't an LA pop quiz, but I think just as kind of a representative way to start to wrap things up, what are one or two shifts that you think is going to happen in LA specifically, or as a representative for major urban metropolitan areas globally? What do you think one or two of the key shifts that has not fully come into being yet, but you think will be really fundamentally transformative in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years? Patrick, I can make half a guess as to what your answer might be, but I'd love to hear, what your thoughts on the timeline and scope that, flying cars and similar technologies might start to change our lives on.
You might.
Yeah,
So,
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, our vehicle is satisfying the automotive and aerospace legislation, which is different from, let's say, an eVTOL. So we're actually looking to deliver the first vehicle in 2 years' time, which is a two-seater. But then the rollout of the full service model of a, let's say, flying ride service, door-to-door model, we're looking at around approximately 5 years from now for that deployment.
I'll throw out an answer.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of this comes down to policy. A lot of it comes down to decisions made about how we build our cities and how we want to live, which hopefully will be a deliberative process. And in many ways, we have the technology we need, right? Bikes can do a lot of things. I've already referenced that. I'm clearly a fan, but cargo bikes can carry a lot of things if we have places to put them and places to ride them. Land use decisions around where we put buildings and where people live and where they work make a huge difference, right? If I have to commute an hour versus I have to commute 10 minutes by foot, that is a totally different game in terms of what mobility device or tool or whatever I need at my disposal. So I think a lot of this comes back to how do we want our cities to look? Is a 15-minute city a real thing? Can we actually do that? Can we manifest that? In LA would be an amazing opportunity, right? You've got bodegas all over the place. You've got little micro hubs that are just waiting to be that 15-minute city. And a friend of mine once said to me, like, oh, LA is great. You just have to drive 30 minutes to every great thing. Every time you want to go to the next great thing, which is interesting because like, how do you make it so actually within every 30 minutes is great? And I don't have to go anywhere because I've got all these amazing things. So I think a lot of it comes back to land use decisions. Again, we're seeing a lot of leadership out of Europe right now in that. Paris has gone from a relatively lower bicycling culture to now 1 in 10 Parisians every day gets on a bike. That's land use. That's decisions around safe riding spaces and safe parking spaces, and a conscious decision from political leadership to say we want our city to be different. And Amsterdam's Amsterdam because they did the same thing. We can do that too. I think it comes down in a lot of cases to policy, and some things comes down to technology innovation. Clearly, flying cars, not yet just a policy thing, but a lot of it we have it. We just have to build it differently.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I had the two things I was going to comment on are, what to look for. I think there's going to be a shift in consumer behavior. And I actually think that's going to be more fundamental. We can come up with all the technologies that we like and the policies, but I think if anything, COVID's taught us that we can work and play a lot differently. We can participate and contribute in different ways that we've never seen before, but people still need to convene and products and services and goods still need to move between regions, although we are getting much more globalization, if you will. So I think we're going to start to see fundamental shifts in the next generation on what their expectations are when it comes to transportation and mobility. And then the other thing that I was having a great breakfast this morning, and we were just talking about adaptation. In some instances, we're not going to have a choice. There's going to be a need to rebuild because climate change is going to take away roads like it just has in Vancouver. If you're watching the news, Highway 1 is flooded, and we have no access to goods by rail or truck right now. And so this aha moment or holy crap moment should really be an opportunity to quickly reflect and make some hard choices on how we're going to rebuild and what that's going to look like. And hopefully innovation and the future of mobility is reflected in those decisions.
And just to start at the state level, one thing that we've done is we have created what's called CAPDI, which is I'm going to get this wrong, climate. It's basically what it is. Sorry, I don't know the acronym, but basically what it is we're looking at our discretionary transportation dollars and saying, how can we actually use those better? How can we use those not to move people around, but to do it in a climate sensitive, sustainable manner? And the implementation of that is actually starting now. And so if anybody's interested, we want public stakeholder input. But basically taking our existing assets and looking at how can we use those better. It doesn't always mean we need new things. We need more things. Sometimes it's just, how can we take, our existing assets, our transit buses, how can we use that to help, deploy broadband services? How can we use our dollars to go farther than we have in the past? And then I do want to give a shout out to LA, because I believe LA has been doing a really, really good job at defining the problem and specifically going to look for those specific solutions. And the problem can be anything from, the climate crisis to how do women specifically move around? How do we make our public transportation systems serve everybody in the way that they serve and not just be focused on those commute hours? The city is doing a fantastic job, and we at the state are looking to them, right? Because we talked earlier about all the cities and towns around the state that do not have the resources that LA does. If they find solutions, I have not been shy at saying, at the state, what can we do? We can, publish something on best practices and really learn from the work that has been done. So it really is in both our spending as well as when we're looking at process, to work smart, not hard. Not everything needs to start from the beginning every single time.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. That was a really fantastic conversation. Really pleased to have gotten to share that with all of you. I think sadly we just ran out of time, but
no, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sam. Please, a round of applause for Sam and all of our panelists here.